The briefing room on Anaxis Station smelled like recycled air and old decisions. Commander Lex stood at the front of it for a long moment before speaking, his back to the 11 pilots who had been pulled from assignments across 3 fleets, and he looked at the holographic display he'd been living inside for 3 years. The Void Hammer, rotating slowly in blue light, beautiful and terrible, a perfect sphere of Drath warships locked in a formation that had never once broken in 40 years of war. Every fleet that has engaged the Drath in open space has been destroyed, he said, without turning around. Not defeated. Not repelled. Destroyed. The Carthage Group, the Velan Task Force, the combined 7th, gone. 41,000 sailors and pilots in 4 engagements. I have spent 3 years looking at why. He turned around. The answer is not complicated. The Drath fight in one formation. They have always fought in one formation. The Void Hammer is a sphere of approximately 300 warships with their heaviest weapons facing outward. The sphere rotates on 3 axes simultaneously, so there is no safe angle of approach. The moment a human fleet engages, the sphere tightens. Every ship that tries to penetrate the formation is destroyed by overlapping fire from dozens of vessels simultaneously. Every fleet that has tried to stand off and bombard from range runs out of ammunition before it runs out of Drath. The formation has never been broken. He let that sit. I found a weakness. Lieutenant Sawyer was the first to lean forward. She was half Velan, her skin a deep iridescent bronze that shifted slightly in the room's blue light, her eyes compound fractured in a way that let her read 6 targeting solutions simultaneously. She'd been flying intercept fighters for 9 years and had twice been the last pilot standing when her squadron was destroyed around her, not through luck, the after-action reports agreed, but through a specific and untenable willingness to make the decision that nobody else would make in time. The sphere forms around the staging area, Lex said. The Drath don't meet a human fleet in open space, they wait. They aggregate in debris fields, in asteroid clusters, in the wreckage of previous engagements. They hold position for days before a battle. And when the human fleet arrives and engages, the sphere doesn't expand outward to meet it. It contracts. It tightens around a fixed point. He pulled up the formation schematics. The weakness is inside. If you have ships inside the sphere when it closes, the formation's own geometry becomes a liability. Every Drath vessel that fires inward risks hitting another Drath vessel on the opposite arc. The overlapping fire that makes the formation impenetrable from outside becomes suicidal from inside. And the command ship at the center, he touched the display and it zoomed, is unshielded. It's never needed shields. Nothing has ever reached it. The room was quiet. I need pilots who can survive 2 weeks inside a Drath staging area. In ships disguised as debris. Silent running, no emissions, no active systems. Waiting for the sphere to close around them. Petty Officer Dmara, sitting in the back row, said, and then you detonate simultaneously from 8 positions inside the sphere. 8 vectors at once, targeting the command ship and 4 load-bearing relay points in the formation's communication architecture. If the relay points go down simultaneously, the sphere loses the synchronization it needs to contract. The formation fragments. The human fleet outside exploits the gap. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people doing mathematics in their heads. You need volunteers, said Lieutenant Caro. He was half Keth, enormous, built like something that had been compressed under tremendous pressure and then released slightly. His Keth heritage gave him a cardiovascular system that could run on 30% oxygen for up to 6 hours, which was the reason he was in this room. His voice was very level. For a mission with a survival rate you haven't mentioned. I need 8 pilots, Lex said. I've looked at 43 candidates. I'm asking 11 of you. He named them one at a time, for reasons, and the reasons were specific. Sawyer for her multi-target processing and her documented willingness to make final decisions. Caro for his oxygen efficiency and his 22 years of formation flying. Lieutenant Wren, half Orvani, whose bone structure could withstand the kind of gravitational fluctuation the Drath staging areas produced, and who had the additional qualification of having survived capture by the Drath for 11 days before rescue. She knew how they moved, how they thought, the specific patterns of their patrol rotations. Ensign Dosey, barely 23, who had achieved the highest recorded score in the service on long-duration solitary mission profiles, she could go silent longer than anyone in the fleet without losing operational cohesion. Petty Officer Dmara, whose Solani heritage meant she processed information in parallel cognitive streams and could monitor 6 systems simultaneously without conscious effort. Flight Specialist Kale, who had been flying debris field navigation for 7 years and whose ship handling in zero visibility conditions was documented at a level that other pilots called something other than skill. Lieutenant Commander Priya, who had designed 3 of the disguise systems they'd be using and who understood their failure modes better than anyone alive. And Ensign Thomas, the youngest, half HSY, who had volunteered for the mission before Lex finished the briefing. The hand had gone up the moment Lex said inside. 3 of the 11 declined. Lex thanked them and they left, and the 8 who remained looked at the void hammer rotating in the blue light, and nobody said anything about survival rates, and that was answer enough. The disguise rigs were beautiful in the way that very functional things sometimes are. Priya had spent 14 months designing them, each ship's hull coated in a composite that absorbed scanner frequencies the way Drath debris naturally absorbed them, the thermal signatures suppressed to match the ambient radiation of fragmented metal, the shapes themselves altered with detachable panels and false contours that gave each vessel the ragged, asymmetric profile of wreckage. They would look, to any Drath scanner, like the remnants of human ships that the Drath had destroyed in this sector 3 years ago. The wreckage was still there, real debris, genuine fragments from the Carthage group, and the 8 of them would drift among it. The insertion happened in darkness, 2 weeks before the battle date. One by one, from 3 different approach vectors, the 8 ships drifted into the debris field on minimum emission trajectories that Kale had calculated over 6 weeks, paths that used the gravitational geometry of the debris field itself to carry them in without thrust, without heat, without any emission that a Drath passive sensor might catch. It took 9 hours for all 8 of them to reach their designated positions. Then they went dark. Complete dark. No communications. No active sensors. Life support on the lowest possible setting. The Keth modification in Caro's biology meant he could tolerate the oxygen reduction, and the Velan and Orvani and Solani heritage of the others gave them similar margins, and Thomas's Rethasai cold tolerance meant he could run his thermal systems at a level that would have been medically inadvisable for a full human and simply wasn't. Lex himself, fully human and therefore the most constrained member of his own team, had spent 18 months training specifically for this, metabolic suppression techniques borrowed from deep cover infantry doctrine, adapted for cockpit conditions, enabling him to stay functional on reduced life support for up to 20 days. On the first day, it was almost peaceful. The debris field was enormous, fragments of the Carthage Group's 6 heavy cruisers and their 32 escort vessels, spread across a volume of space roughly 300 kilometers in diameter, slowly drifting in the gravitational pull of a brown dwarf that Lex's charts called HR 7741 and that the pilots, in the briefings, had simply called the Dark Star. The wreckage was dense enough to provide cover. It was also, Lex had known intellectually and was now experiencing physically, genuinely beautiful in the cold indifferent way of things that existed without caring about being observed, shards of hull plating catching the faint light of distant stars, tumbling slowly, casting no shadows because there was nothing nearby to cast them toward. Drath ships moved through the field on the second day. The first one passed approximately 4 kilometers from Lex's position, a Drath medium scout, its hull the characteristic matte black of the species' favored materials, its sensor arrays rotating in the slow methodical sweep pattern that Wren had documented in her after-action report from captivity. Lex watched it on his passive visual system and did not breathe in a way that he was aware of, and the scout moved on, and his heart rate did not return to normal for 40 minutes. On the third day, 2 more Drath vessels entered the field and began positioning. They were not scouts. They were early arrivals for the formation. The Void Hammer took days to aggregate, and the Drath were meticulous about it, each ship moving to its designated position in the sphere with a precision that, watching it, was genuinely awe-inspiring in the way that an enemy's competence could be awe-inspiring when you were lying very still in the dark and watching them build the thing that was meant to kill you. By the 5th day, 40 Drath vessels had taken position around the debris field. Lex's suit had a small system for psychological monitoring, not broadcasting anything, just logging, and on the morning of the 6th day it flagged a deviation in his cortisol pattern that the software described, with the neutral precision of medical systems, as consistent with prolonged acute stress response. He looked at the flag for a moment and then dismissed the notification because there was nothing to be done about it. He thought about his pilots. He couldn't check on them, couldn't send so much as a single photon pulse without risking detection, but he knew their positions from the insertion plan and he ran them through his mind the way he ran his fuel calculations, methodically, in order. Soyor was 3 kilometers to his port aft, drifting slightly faster than her designated position because of a minor gravitational gradient Kale had predicted and she'd compensated for correctly on insertion. Caro was 7 kilometers forward, his ship the most convincingly disguised of all of them. He'd added his own modifications to Priya's rig, unprompted, that had made it look more battered, more genuinely destroyed. Wren was the deepest in the field, 18 kilometers from Lex's position, closest to where the sphere center would eventually form, which was the position she'd requested and gotten. Wren, on the 6th day, had a Drath soldier walk across her hull. She documented it afterward, in the debrief that none of them knew if they'd live to give, by logging a single notation in her mission record. 1,347 hours, Drath infantry unit, standard patrol configuration, hull contact lasting approximately 40 seconds. No detection. Held position. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, without ornament, without the thing that the 40 seconds must actually have been, a Drath soldier's boots on the hull above her, close enough that the sound conducted through the metal and into the cockpit, and Wren sitting perfectly still in the dark and waiting. On the 7th day, Dosi did something that Lex didn't know about until the debrief. Her life support recycler had developed a minor fault, a seal degrading, CO2 scrubbing operating at 70% efficiency, and she had repaired it by hand in the dark without activating any diagnostic systems, working by tactile memory of the recycler's components, taking 4 hours to isolate and fix the seal while her CO2 levels climbed into ranges that should have produced cognitive impairment. Her post-mission blood chemistry showed that they had. She had repaired a critical life support system while impaired, in the dark, without making a single sound, because making a sound would have killed her as surely as the CO2. Dmara, to port of Lex's position, was the one he worried about on the technical level. Not because her nerve was in question, but because the Solani parallel processing that made her so extraordinary in active combat became, in conditions of sensory deprivation and forced inaction, a specific kind of torment. She'd known this going in, she'd disclosed it in the mission prep and insisted on going anyway. She had prepared by developing, over the 14 months of mission planning, a system of internal processing exercises that kept all 6 cognitive streams occupied with different tasks simultaneously: orbital mechanics calculations, tactical scenario modeling, ship systems diagnostics run mentally without activating the actual systems, a sequential reconstruction of every engagement she'd ever flown in full technical detail. She ran through them all on a rotation and then started over. She did this for 14 days, and it worked, and it was one of the most difficult things any of them did. Kale, who had been navigating debris fields for 7 years and who felt a version of comfortable in this environment that nobody else on the team quite shared, spent the 2 weeks in a state of focused technical observation that he afterward described as the best flying of his life, which confused the debrief officer because he was not technically flying. But he was watching, reading the gravitational currents and the slow tumbling dynamics of the debris field, tracking the Drath ship's positions through passive visual alone, building in his head a continuously updated 3-dimensional model of the space that surrounded him, noting every shift and adjustment in the formation as it grew. By the 2nd week he had mapped all 312 Drath vessels, their positions, their drift rates, the gaps in their patrol patterns. He had been supposed to hold a fixed position and he had held it, but he had done more than hold it. He had understood the geometry of the sphere better than any of the simulation models they'd trained on, and the knowledge would matter. Priya, in the 9th day, discovered that one of the 8 explosive packages attached to her hull, the specialized charges they would use in the attack, disguised as debris, had shifted in its mounting. Not dangerously, not critically, but enough that the detonation geometry would be wrong. She evaluated this for 3 hours by passive sensor and concluded, correctly, that she could not correct it remotely and could not correct it without an EVA, and an EVA was not possible, and so she recalculated her attack run to account for the shifted charge geometry and then spent 6 hours running the new math until she was certain it was right. Then she ran it again. Thomas, the youngest, the one whose hand had gone up before Lex finished the sentence, Thomas spent 2 weeks being afraid in a way that he had not expected and had not prepared for, and which did not stop him from being ready. The fear was not of the Drath, exactly, or not only. It was a specific fear of the confined and the dark and the long wait, the fear that had no action to discharge into, that sat in the body as a physical pressure behind the sternum and did not go away when you breathed through it because you were breathing as shallowly as possible to conserve oxygen. He was 23 years old and he lay very still in his cockpit in the dark, and he was afraid every day, and he did not break radio silence once, and he did not move from his insertion position, and on the 13th day a Drath frigate took station approximately 1 kilometer to his starboard side and stayed there, and he looked at it through his passive visual, its hull markings, the slow revolution of its weapons array, the tiny orange glow of its engine heat, and he did not move. The Drath frigate did not move either. They drifted together like that, the frigate and the disguised ship and the 23-year-old inside who had been afraid for 13 days, for 11 hours, until the frigate was called to its formation position and moved away. On the 14th day, passive sensors across the field registered a frequency modulation in the background radiation, a specific pattern that Wren had identified from her captivity, a Drath signal that translated, approximately, to formation close. And then, at the edge of the system, at the maximum range of the passive sensors, there were lights. Human ships. Admiral Varsev's fleet, 60 warships coming in fast, in the standard approach formation that Command had maintained for consistency, because the approach didn't matter, because every approach had failed the same way, because the point was not the approach but what was already inside. The sphere began to close. It happened over the course of 4 hours, and watching it from inside was a different experience than any simulation had prepared any of them for. The Drath ships that had been loosely distributed through and around the debris field began to move to their positions with a coordination that seemed, watching it, less like a military formation and more like a biological process, the way a hand closes, each finger independent and yet part of a single coherent motion. They moved without haste, without any visible communication, with the confidence of a species that had done this exact thing 400 times and lost nothing and won everything. The sphere took shape in 3 dimensions simultaneously, ships locking into position at calculated intervals, the geometry becoming more defined with every passing minute. Lex was inside it. All 8 of them were inside it. He could see Soyoz's position. She was 3 kilometers to his port aft, still, her ship invisible against the debris, and he could see Ren's position, deeper in the field, and he could count, on the passive visual, the Drath ships taking position around them. The sphere was 312 vessels. It was approximately 200 kilometers in diameter. It was rotating, as it always rotated, on 3 simultaneous axes. The command ship was at the center of it. He could see its heat signature now, because at this range and with the sphere forming around it, the command ship had come active, its systems powering up for engagement. The human fleet was still approaching. 60 ships against 312, and every simulation, every historical engagement, every piece of tactical analysis Lex had done said they would all be dead within 20 minutes of full engagement. Except. He looked at the command ship in the center of the sphere, 14 kilometers from his position, sitting in the exact center of the formation it had built, unshielded, confident, and he thought about 41,000 dead, and he thought about 3 years of study, and he thought about 8 pilots in the dark for 2 weeks, and he thought, now. But not yet. The sphere had to fully close first. The relay nodes had to be at final position. If any of the 8 of them moved too early, the Drath would see them and the formation would adapt and the whole thing would collapse. Not the sphere, but the plan, and the human fleet outside would die anyway. He waited. The outer fleet engaged at a range of 80 kilometers. Lex could hear the battle on passive sensors, not hear, exactly, but feel it, the electromagnetic wash of weapons fire at scale, the distortion in the background radiation that meant energy weapons in the megaton range being discharged repeatedly, the specific frequency signatures of Drath point defense systems coming online across the entire sphere simultaneously. The sphere tightened. He watched it on his display, the 312 ships reducing their spacing, the formation becoming more dense, the gaps closing. Outside, human ships were dying. He didn't know which ones. He couldn't know. He sat inside the sphere and waited and did not act, and outside people were dying, and the weight of that was a physical thing, a pressure in the chest, and he waited. Kale's voice came on the channel, a tight burst, 1 second, the first communication any of them had sent in 2 weeks. Relay node 4 is at final position. Formation is complete. It was the signal they'd agreed on. Not Lex's voice. Kale's, because Kale had been watching the geometry for 14 days and he was the one who would know. Lex hit his drive and said, "All points, execute." The inside of the Void Hammer when 8 ships came alive simultaneously was, for approximately 1.3 seconds, the most confused space in the engagement. Then it was the most violent. Lex went for the command ship directly. His disguise rig blew off in 3 panels as his drive came up, the panels tumbling away behind him, fake debris becoming real debris, and his ship went from cold drifting wreck to full military thrust in a transition that his body registered as a wall, a sudden declaration of forces that had been suppressed for 2 weeks, and the command ship was 14 kilometers ahead and closing, and the Drath had not yet understood what was happening. They understood quickly. The sphere's response to an internal threat was documented in Ren's intelligence report, and in 3 of the engagement analyses Lex had spent years studying. The formation contracted. The Drath ships at the inner layer of the sphere turned inward, redirecting fire. But they were built to fire outward. The weapon's geometry was wrong for this. The overlapping fire fields that made the sphere impenetrable from outside became, from inside, a coordination problem. Every Drath ship that fired at an internal target risked hitting the ships on the opposite arc, and the sphere's rotation complicated every targeting solution, and for approximately 4 minutes the Void Hammer was solving a problem it had never been designed to solve. Soyoz went for Relay Node 2. She flew the intercept on 3 simultaneous targeting solutions, her compound-fractured eyes reading the geometry the way other pilots couldn't, tracking the formation's rotation, calculating the window between 2 Drath ships' fields of fire, threading the needle through a gap that was 30 meters wide and moving at 14 kilometers per second. She hit it. She went through it and rolled hard to port, and the energy weapon that had been tracking her went through the space her ship had just vacated and hit the Drath ship on the opposite arc, and the Drath ship died in a way that was not her problem because she was already 15 kilometers away and pulling 2/3 of her thrust toward Node 2. Node 2 was a Drath destroyer that served as a communications relay for 1/8 of the sphere's coordination architecture. It was larger than she was. It was now aware of her and turning its weapons toward her. She had the charge. She flew straight at the destroyer until the point where any reasonable calculation said she would not survive the turn, and then she did something that wasn't on any of the calculation models. She did not turn. She fired the charge on a proximity fuse at a range of 800 meters, rolled inverted, hit her lateral thrusters at full power, and went under the destroyer's keel at a range of 40 meters with the explosion happening directly above her. The shockwave hit her ship like a hammer. 3 of her secondary systems went offline. Her canopy cracked, not breached but cracked, a spiderweb fracture across the upper right quadrant of her visual field. She came out the other side of the explosion and her ship was still flying, and Relay Node 2 was not a destroyer anymore. Caro went for Node 3, and it took him longer because Node 3 was on the far side of the sphere from his insertion point, and he had to cross 14 kilometers of active combat space to reach it. He flew in a straight line. This was not tactically sophisticated. It was tactically correct, because the Drath fire control systems were dealing with 8 simultaneous internal threats and the sphere's rotation was making their targeting solutions non-trivial, and a straight line at full Keth-optimized thrust was harder to hit than the evasive patterns that his conscious mind was screaming at him to execute. He took one hit. A glancing strike from a Drath point defense unit that blew his port thruster array and spun him 40 degrees off course and cost him 11 seconds to correct. He corrected it and kept flying and got to Node 3 and did what he'd come to do. Ren went for the command ship. She had been the closest, 18 kilometers at insertion, and 18 kilometers was nothing when you had 2 weeks of silent observation and knew every patrol pattern and weapons rotation and response time of every ship between her and the target. She flew the gaps with the knowledge of someone who had mapped them by hand, in the dark, over 14 days, and the command ship grew in her visual field. Not large, not as large as she'd expected, smaller than the Drath destroyers, sleek and dark and suddenly very aware that something was coming from inside its own formation. The command ship had no shields. It had never needed them. It fired at her with everything it had, and the weapons meant for ships much farther away were badly calibrated for a target at 2 kilometers and closing, and Ren rolled through the fire with the specific unhurried precision of someone who had already made the calculation and knew the margin was there, even if the margin was very small. She fired her charge at point-blank range and pulled away, and the charge did what charges do, and the command ship's primary systems went offline in a cascade that Lex could see from across the sphere as a sudden silence in the electromagnetic signature, a command node going dark. That was 3 of the 5 targets down. Relay nodes 2 and 3 and the command ship's primary communications. The sphere was now fighting without 40% of its coordination architecture, and it knew it, and it did what the Void Hammer did when threatened, it contracted. Hard. Fast. All 312 ships pulling inward, trying to crush the attackers inside with geometry, with mass, with the formation's own density becoming a weapon. Kale saw it coming before anyone else. He'd been watching the geometry for 14 days. He knew the speed of the contraction from 7 historical references. He knew his own position in it. He knew Priya's position. She was 4 kilometers to his starboard, flying her corrected attack run on Relay Node 4, dealing with the shifted charge geometry she'd spent 6 hours recalculating. She was almost to the node. The contracting sphere had 2 ships pulling into the space between Kale and Priya, a Drath cruiser from starboard high and a Drath frigate from port low, their courses, in the geometry of the collapsing formation, converging on the same point. Kale hit his comms. "Priya. The cruiser to your high starboard." "I see it," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was. "Can you make the node before it reaches you?" A half-second pause that was not hesitation but calculation. Yes. She made the node. She fired the charge. The node went down. The cruiser's weapons, tracking her, coming for her, fired at a range of 900 meters, and she had known they would, and she pulled the turn she had calculated, and the shot went wide and she was clear, and Kale, watching from 4 kilometers, allowed himself 1 second of relief. Then Relay Node 1 exploded. Dmara had gotten there first, through a route that nobody had been tracking because Dmara's navigation through the collapsing sphere had been, by later analysis, the most extraordinary piece of flying in the engagement, 6 simultaneous cognitive streams keeping track of 6 different threat vectors while flying an approach course that threaded between contracting ships with margins that the post-engagement analysis measured in single-digit meters. She had been afraid, during the 2 weeks, of what the inaction and silence would do to her processing. In motion, in the chaos of 8-direction combat, she was exactly the opposite of afraid. She was entirely herself. She was doing 6 things at once, flawlessly, and Relay Node 1 went down, and Dmara came out of the attack run already calculating her exit vector. 4 of 5 targets destroyed. Command ship dark. The sphere's coordination architecture down to 20% functional capacity. Lex was still flying for the command ship. The primary communications were down, but the ship itself was intact and the secondary systems were still running, and the Void Hammer's contraction was still underway because some of its coordination was local. The ships could see each other, could maintain formation spacing optically and by short-range radar, and until the formation physically broke, human ships outside were still dying. He needed to break it. Not damage it. Break it. He hit the command ship with both his charges. He'd been allocated two, for this purpose, the command ship being the hardest target, and the ship's hull vented in two places and the secondary systems went offline and the command ship's engine signature dropped to 0. The vessel that had been coordinating the most lethal formation in 40 years of war was now a dead hulk at the center of the sphere. The sphere was still intact. Still contracting. Thomas and Dosey were still flying. Thomas had relay node 5, the last relay target, on the inner far arc of the formation, the hardest position in the attack plan, the one that had drawn the most concern in briefing because it required crossing almost the full diameter of the sphere. He had flown it in the training simulations 31 times. He had made it in 27 of those runs. He had flown it in his head during the 2 weeks in the dark until the course was not a thought but a physical memory, his hands knowing the sequence of turns before his mind articulated them. He flew it now, and the simulation and the reality were the same and not the same because the simulation didn't have a sphere contracting inward, ships pulling toward the center, the geometry changing in real time, the gaps closing. He was making adjustments he hadn't trained for, improvising within the structure of the memorized course, and it was working until the draft frigate that had been his neighbor for 11 hours on day 13 appeared in his path on a collision course, contracting toward the center on its formation track, and Thomas had enough angle to avoid it and did, rolling hard under its keel, and the roll put him on the wrong approach angle for node 5. He had 6 seconds to recalculate. He recalculated. He came at node 5 from 43 degrees off the optimal angle and it was wrong and it was going to work anyway because he was moving very fast and the charge had a proximity fuse and the optimal angle was optimal, not necessary, and he fired it at the right moment on the wrong angle and node 5 died. The sphere had lost all 5 coordination relay points and the command ship. By the doctrine Lex had studied, by the analysis of every engagement the Drath had ever fought, this was the point at which the formation should fragment, each ship defaulting to individual action, the coordination that made the sphere lethal dissolving into 312 separate tactical problems. The Drath sphere did not fragment. It contracted. It was doing what it knew to do, which was the thing it had always done, which was close. Without the coordination architecture it was doing it imperfectly, ships pulling inward at slightly different rates, the geometry becoming irregular, gaps opening and closing asymmetrically. But it was still 312 warships and they were still all pulling inward and Lex could see on his display what was about to happen. The contracting formation was going to reach the density at which human ships at the outside range simply could not survive the overlapping fire. He needed a gap. He needed the sphere to not just lose coordination but to physically break, a physical gap in the formation wide enough for the human fleet to exploit. He was out of charges. He opened the fleet-wide channel for the first time in 2 weeks. I need a gap. Someone break the formation. Make a physical gap. 3 seconds of silence. Then Kale said, I have a solution. Dose's voice came in over his, simultaneous, I have it. There was a pause of approximately 1 second that Lex would think about for the rest of his life, and then Kale said, I'm closer, and Dosey said, no, and then Kale said Dosey, and Dosey said, I'm already in the approach, and she was. She had calculated it. When, exactly, Lex didn't know, but she had seen it, the gap that could be forced, the 2 Drath ships pulling inward on converging tracks that if struck at the right moment and the right angle would not just destroy them but force them outward, against the contraction, opening a hole in the sphere's arc. It required a ship moving fast enough to impart the correct force vector, and it required that ship to be between the 2 Drath vessels at the moment of impact, and there was no version of that calculation in which the ship survived. Dosey, Lex said. The angle is good, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, which was calm, which had been calm for every day of 2 weeks in the dark, calm in the repair of the recycler with impaired cognition, calm now. The gap will be 40 seconds. Tell them to go on my mark. Dosey, there is another. Commander. A half-second pause. Tell them to go on my mark. He opened the fleet channel. Admiral Varsev. On Dosey's mark, push through at grid 77 Alpha. You'll have 40 seconds. A burst of static from the fleet. Varsev's voice, confirmed. Lex looked at his display. Dosey's ship was a fast-moving point of light on the inner arc of the sphere, closing on the 2 converging Drath vessels, and Kale's ship was on a parallel course 4 kilometers to her starboard, and then Kale did something that the post-engagement analysis would spend 6 months trying to explain. He went with her. Not the same target, not the same angle, not the same physics, but he closed the distance between them to 3 kilometers and then to 2, staying on a parallel track, flying beside her into the converging draft ships, and Dosi said, "Kale, you don't have to," and Kale said, "I know." And then his ship hit the portside draft vessel a half second before Dosi hit the starboard, and the physics of 2 simultaneous impacts rather than 1 were different. The force vectors changed, and the gap that opened was not 40 seconds. It was 90. The 2 draft ships blew outward against the contraction, tumbling away from the sphere's geometry, and the gap in the formation was 3 kilometers wide, and Kale's ship and Dosi's ship were not there anymore, and Lex said nothing for a moment. "Mark," he said, because that was what Dosi would have said. The human fleet came through the gap. 60 ships through a 3-kilometer gap in 90 seconds is not a comfortable operation. It is a controlled chaos of threading and timing and point defense fire, ships taking hits and pushing through and deploying fire into the interior of the sphere while the sphere tried to close the gap and couldn't close it fast enough against the force vectors Kale and Dosi had imposed on it. The draft ships on either side of the gap were firing at everything and being fired at from within the gap, and the physics of the sphere's contraction were now working against it. The ships that had been pulling inward were still pulling inward, and they were pulling into human vessels that were pushing outward, and the formation geometry fractured. Not all at once. Not cleanly. The void hammer did not shatter like glass. It broke the way complex structures break, section by section, local failures cascading into larger failures, the coordination that remained in the system trying to compensate for each new breach and failing because there was too much to compensate for simultaneously. Drath ships broke from formation. Some of them turned outward and began individual engagements with the human fleet. Some of them turned toward Lex's team, which was still inside. Sawyer destroyed 2 of those ships with a targeting precision that the engagement recorder later noted was statistically improbable. Caro destroyed one with his remaining charge, flying it as a torpedo because his own ship's primary weapons had been knocked offline. Ren, who had been deepest in the field and was now the deepest inside the broken sphere, destroyed another with her secondary weapons and then had to run, really run, because the broken formation's response was to mass whatever ships could respond toward the center, and she was at the center. She ran for the gap and she made it, because she was Ren and she had been running from Drath ships since before she was captured, and she knew the geometries and she knew the speed margins, and she got out. Lex was the last one. He flew through the collapsing interior of the formation, not the sphere anymore, not a formation, just 312 ships in various states of combat and retreat and individual action, and he found the gap and went through it, and behind him the void hammer was not the void hammer anymore. It was wreckage and debris and fighting, the same as any other engagement, the outcome uncertain in the way that all outcomes are uncertain once the decisive advantage is lost. Human ships were dying. Drath ships were dying. The battle was not won. Battles do not end cleanly, but the formation that had never been broken was broken, and the engagement was now a fight rather than a slaughter, and those were different things. He flew out through the gap into the space beyond the sphere, and he kept flying until he was 100 kilometers out, and then he cut his thrust and drifted. He opened his internal channel. Not the fleet channel. The team channel, which had been silent for 2 weeks and then erupted into 8 voices and was now very quiet. "Sawyer." "Here," she said. "Caro." "Here." His voice was rough, the oxygen reduction of 2 weeks catching up now that he could afford to feel it. "Ren." 3 seconds. Then, "Here." She sounded like someone who had just run a very long distance. He let out a breath. 3. Dmara. Silence. Dosi. Silence. He knew. He'd watched it. He said her name anyway. Kale. Silence. Priya. Silence. Thomas. Silence. He called each of the 5 names again. He called them clearly, the way you call them when you know and are making yourself know it completely before you stop. Dmara. Dosi. Kale. Priya. Thomas. 5 names, twice each, into the silence of the team channel. Then he stopped calling. He looked at the wreckage around him. 200 kilometers of it, spreading across the engagement volume. Pieces of draft ships, pieces of human ships, the debris he and his team had drifted among for 2 weeks, all mixed now with newer destruction, newer fragments. The debris field that was HR 7741's neighborhood permanently changed by today's events. He could not have identified, looking at any particular fragment, which fleet it had come from. It was all just broken metal now, spinning slowly in the light of the distant stars. He opened the fleet channel. "This is Commander Lex. The hammer is down. 3 of 8 returning." The battle was still ongoing at the 100-kilometer range. He could see it on his passive display. The 2 forces engaged in the chaotic individual combat that followed a formation break. the outcome being decided ship by ship and decision by decision in the way that battles are actually decided when you strip away the strategic layer and get down to the human layer underneath. He watched it and waited. A long pause from command. Admiral Varsev's voice, and the pause had been long enough that Lex had time to wonder what the Admiral was doing in that moment, what a person does with their face in the moment after hearing that number, and then, understood, Commander. Welcome back. Lex looked at the wreckage. He did not respond. He opened his navigation system and put in a course for the fleet's secondary rally point, the rendezvous coordinate that had been designated in the mission brief for the 3 ships that might return or the 8 ships that might return or whatever number came out the other side of this. He looked at the course and then he looked at the wreckage one more time. Pieces of Drath formation ships and pieces of human fleet ships and pieces, somewhere in there, of Dmara's hull plating and Priya's disguised rig and Thomas's ship that had sat for 11 hours beside a Drath frigate while a 23-year-old was afraid in the dark and did not move. He couldn't find any of those pieces by looking. He couldn't distinguish them from any other debris. They were part of it now, part of the permanent record of this engagement, the physical evidence that something had happened here, a formation broken, a calculation paid out to its final decimal. He engaged his drive. He flew. Behind him, slowly, the wreckage continued its patient tumbling in the light of the dark star. No velocity, no destination, no urgency. While 200 kilometers away the last of the Void Hammer was finished for good, ship by ship, the ending written in fire across a sky that had no witness but the cold indifferent stars, which had been watching this kind of thing for longer than any formation had ever held, and would watch it long after the last ship flying was gone.